a firm believer in the advice to say what you have to say and then shut up. So this talk will be somewhat short. Please look disappointed. So as Mark said, back in July, one of the coffee and conversation discussions was about loving your enemies. And we had a good discussion, but I thought there were some interesting things that we never got around to talking about. So I'm addressing the topic again. So when Jesus said, love your neighbor, someone conveniently asked him, who is my neighbor? When he said, love your enemies, apparently nobody needed to ask for clarification. But I think it's a good question. Who are your enemies? Let's start by considering some people who are not your enemies. People who disagree with you or argue with you are not enemies. People who dislike you or disapprove of you are not enemies. Even people who hate you are not enemies. My definition of an enemy is someone who intends to harm you. That doesn't include someone who hates you and wishes you would die, unless they take steps to make it happen. So how many enemies do you actually have? Do you know anyone who might try to murder you? Or even beat you severely? I know a lot of people can answer yes to those questions, but I'm guessing that no one here today can. Maybe someone causes you psychological harm, and sometimes that isn't even their conscious intention. Are they enemies if they harm you without premeditation? And what about people who would harm you by depriving you of some of your rights and freedoms? Are they enemies? I think we need to consider both the harm someone causes and their intentions. If someone who hates you tries to run over you with their car, that person would be an enemy. But if someone loses control of their car on an icy road and hits you, you wouldn't consider them an enemy. What if the road was dry and the driver was drunk? You would probably blame that driver much more than the one that slid on the ice. But is that driver your enemy? I think these questions are interesting, but for the most part, irrelevant. If you can learn to love your enemies, surely you can love all those other folks also. So I guess the next obvious question is, why should you love your enemies? You should love your enemies for the same reason you should forgive people, because you will be a happier person if you do. Having hostile feelings towards someone will make you miserable. It can ruin your physical and mental health. I like to quote the bumper sticker I saw several years ago. Love your enemies, then you won't have any. The point isn't that love will magically transform your enemies, although I'll talk more about that in a minute. The point is that being enemies, just like being friends, is a kind of relationship. It requires that both parties consent to it. If someone claims to be your friend, but you don't feel particularly friendly toward them, you can say, no, I'm sorry, I don't think I do that way. Friendship is a mutual agreement. Being enemies is similar. If someone considers himself your enemy, you're free to say, no, sorry, I don't think of you that way. And then you won't have any enemies. Isn't that a better way to go through life? Another reason to love your enemies is that it's easier for them to hate you if you respond to them with animosity. Hostility creates hostility. If you respond to them with love, It might encourage them to look more deeply into the reasons for their attitudes. They can't very well blame you for the situation if you're treating them with love. It might cause them to question the narrative they've created about them and to accept some responsibility for their behavior. Loving your enemies might contribute to their spiritual growth. One more reason to love your enemies is that there is way too much hatred, hostility, and violence in the world already. You can avoid adding to it. Thoughts and emotions carry energy. The world is currently awash in negative energy. We need to project all the positive energy we can. Putting more love out into the world is an urgent need. And the final reason to love your enemies is to be a good example for others. Demonstrate that there is a better way. At this point, I should probably make it clear that loving your enemies doesn't mean trusting them. Have you ever had a friend or relative that you love who has some troublesome fault? Like maybe they aren't very truthful? That doesn't keep you from loving them, but it does keep you from believing everything they say. So you can love your enemies while recognizing that you can't trust them. Love them, but don't turn your back. I happen to be quite fond of bears. I feel a lot of empathy and affection for them. I always enjoy seeing them out in the woods. But I'm very aware that they can be dangerous, and I never forget that. Some people need to be treated in a similar way. And I'll add that, in my opinion, loving your enemies does not mean that you can't defend yourself if you're physically attacked. Some people will disagree. I think that's a personal, moral decision. So, if you decide that you want to love your enemies, how can you do that? Feeling love for someone who wants to harm you is not easy. Remember that no one sets out to be one of the bad guys. Most people want to believe that they are good and that they are doing the right thing. If they're hurting others, they will find ways to rationalize that behavior as being necessary. Taking a deep, honest look at one's own behavior and motivations is a pretty uncommon practice. People believe they are good, and so whatever they are doing must be right. Loving your enemies requires that you feel compassion, which depends on empathy. One good approach to feeling empathy is to remember that nearly all of us are wounded and damaged in some way. The kind and degree of damage differ from person to person, and the effects on a person's attitudes and behavior can range from mild to extreme. It may be that some hateful, violent person started life as a loving, sensitive child. In fact, most people start life as a loving, sensitive child. Then stuff happens. All kinds of stuff happens. Some people withdraw, some struggle to be accepted, and some become angry. Have you ever had to deal with chronic back pain or a severe headache that won't go away? How does that affect your mood? Are you maybe less tolerant and more irritable? Do you get angry more easily? Angry people are often in pain. Emotional pain can be worse than physical pain because it doesn't go away. If you have to deal with someone who is always angry, remember that they are probably in pain. Have compassion for their suffering. All that stuff that happens to us often makes people fearful. They may have specific fears, or they may find everything in life to be potentially threatening. They become hypervigilant, always expecting to be attacked in some way, whether verbally or physically. They are ready to respond with hostility to every perceived threat. This is a miserable way to go through life. These people are also suffering. Have compassion for them. And then there's the fact that fearful people are easily manipulated. They can be convinced that some individual or some particular group of people threaten them and are their enemies. Wars depend on this manipulation. It's also causing much of the violence in our country right now. Most of the racial and ethnic violence arises from fear. In our culture, people are rarely taught to think for themselves. Religious indoctrination and public school indoctrination teach people to believe what they are told. If they are told someone is an enemy, they believe it. To some extent, they are victims of their cultural upbringing. Even in warfare, we should try to understand the so-called enemy. If you were a farmer in Vietnam in the 1960s, you would have believed that American soldiers were evil. They invaded and occupied your country, destroyed your crops, killed your animals, and maybe murdered some of your friends. But those soldiers were mostly teenagers, mostly drafted, and mostly convinced that they were the good guys because they were fighting communism. The Russians fighting in Ukraine today may not be much different, except they believe they're fighting fascism. I have to wonder whether loving your enemies could be effective at the national level. Our government's foreign policy seems to be based entirely on Colin Powell's desire for us to be the biggest bully on the block. Bullies create fear. Fear creates enemies. What if we were the nice kid on the block? The one who makes friends easily, helps people, and tries to resolve disagreements? How many enemies would we have then? We would still be one of the biggest kids on the block, so nobody would push us around. But we could work at settling disputes rather than creating them, selling tractors instead of tanks, and helping all countries to have thriving economies. Instead of the biggest bully, we could be Mr. Rogers. I can't think of anything that would do as much for our national security. So to sum up, I believe that loving your enemies is better for you, better for them, and better for everyone else on earth. And the best way to love your enemies is to have compassion for them, because they are probably suffering. I'll close with a quote from Martin Luther King. He said, "There is a final reason I think that Jesus says, love your enemies. It's this, that love has within it a redemptive power. And there is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period. But just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see. It is redemptive. And this is why Jesus says love. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. There's something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So love your enemies." Okay, we've got lots of time to talk about it now.